Well, good evening, and welcome to Art Stream with Trey Gallaher. This has been a little bit since the last time we streamed, but finally getting around to it. Looking forward to this evening. It's evening where we are. Not sure where you are, but it's a beautiful Saturday evening. Had a nice day with the family. And now looking forward to doing some drawing. I wanted to get back to this design. And it's been a couple weeks, I think, since I last left off on this one. And I wanted to finish up with this pirate design, which has been a couple episodes working. And I wanted to finish up with this body design that I did for an initial concept portrait. So sometimes I'll go with the body first and then work up a more closer detailed headshot. Or sometimes I'm feeling like I know the character up close, and then I'll work backwards and do the body second. And that's the case this time. So if you're back with us, thanks for coming back. Thanks for checking us out. Usually streaming Saturday or Sunday nights. But honestly, it's been a little intermittent lately. So thanks for coming back if you're back this evening. Anyway, so tonight I'll be working on toned paper. Actually, it's slightly different than what I initially started with, toned paper. Just different brand, and you can see a little bit of the difference between the two. This one's just a little bit darker. This one maybe has just a titch more flake in it, a little more texture. So, but that's stuff that'll be easily adjustable in a portfolio situation a little bit later. So, if both of these go in digitally, those little corrections can be made. But I'm going to be working with Copics this evening. So, I like the Copic brand for a couple of reasons. I used to use Prismacolor for a lot of years, and that's a great brand as well. But once the brush tips really hit, and it's been a while now, but once they initially hit, Copic was one of the first people on that. And then, of course, one of the other conscious things that I really like to be aware of in my art supplies is trying to get replenishable supplies. Instead of just throwing out something and going and buying another one, I'm always trying to find supplies that I can replenish at a better cost, actually. In terms of the quality of the ink, they're pretty close to Prismacolors equally. I think they're all pretty close. But I do like the replenishable fluid, and then, of course, the nibs as well. So I like that. I can kind of refill as I need to. Anyway, I'll be working with Copics. This is the Sketch series, which, by the way, has a chisel tip on one end and the brush tip on the other. I'll be working in warm grays this evening. So I oftentimes will work with warm grays, especially on characters. And then I'm also working in pretty much a 3-value system, meaning I try to go with 3 different ranges of values when I'm blocking in. I usually go with something in the range of 20%, 50%, and either 80 or 70, kind of depending on what it is that I'm doing. But having a good 3-value separation really makes for stronger pictures. So, at least in the initial block in. Now, I don't often use markers exclusively, so there's a lot of values you could get in between, and if you have them, great. But in a case of a concept sketch like this, I'm looking for something that makes the picture punchy and shows enough separation of values so that I can really see that form the way that I need to see it. So tonight I'm working with warm grays, and I'm looking at 10%, 50%, and I have a 70%. I'm not quite sure how that 30 got in there, but you never know. I have another 70 over here, though. So I'll be working with those. and then working up a 3-value system. Sorry, just looking for my 70% here. Make sure I got it before I get rolling. There we go. Yeah. Now, if you have other values in between, it's perfectly fine to use those, but again, most great design work is simplified, and it's the big decisions that make the bigger difference in the quality of your result, rather than the subtleties most of the time. Now, you get into some fine detail painting and rendering, and of course the details are where it's at, but in a concept sketch and general picture making, 3 values is what you want to be concentrating on. Okay, one other thing too is I want to be trying to match technique with what I'm working on over here. And I originally had started this with markers, like a regular ebony sketch pencil, which is one of my favorite things to sketch with. And then some markers, and then actually I'm coming back in with some detail work. And I'll be using 2 different types of pens. I like the High-Tech C, and of course some gel pens too, mostly because there's a little bit of detail difference in these. So I'll probably start with one and maybe finish with the other. So they're getting some ink in combination there, and then last but not least, working up with a little bit of white Prismacolor. Now, maybe in a few areas, if it's bright enough, I might use a jelly. Jellies are really great. And if need be, maybe some opaque white. But honestly, this is just a sketch, so I'm not sure I'll go that far. But if need be, I have opaque white. I really like the Dr. Martin's bleed proof white. To check and make sure we're looking okay. It's been a little while since I've used this. Stir it up a little bit. So that's the materials, and again, I'll be trying to emulate what I did here. I wasn't so conscious of the materials when I started here, but since I am emulating it, I'll be trying to get a little bit of the same result pretty much in the end. Now, last time we talked, I had gone back and done some final tweaks on this piece here, and I had sort of worked out a little bit of this kind of jacket shape, which is not really shown here, but I'm giving the same kind of neckline. So really, I've added a little bit of a jacket. I had juxtaposed the hips and the shoulders to give the sense that he's carrying some weight, and then try to get a little bit of balance in there, and then of course capturing somewhat of the suspicious look on the face as well. Now, I am missing a little bit of detail up here in the face, which I'll probably start to include a little bit more, and I am going to be trying to make these two feel like each other. So in the end, I want it to feel like it's the same character. I'd actually say in some ways this character over here almost looks a little more polished than my guy on the left, so I'll be trying to get that same kind of rough quality to him. And I think it's all about sort of those brooding eyes. So we'll get into some details there, but for now, I'm going to start in working with my markers a little bit lighter, and I'm going to dab out a little bit of my graphite, because I don't want such a heavy graphite line that it's mixing heavy with my markers, which can happen. And I do want it to mix with the markers, but I don't want it to mix with the markers in such a way that it's muddying it. I want to keep my markers with a clean application. So he's got to have a little bit of a brooding look to him. Some of these details I'll come in later anyway, because as I start to do markers, some of the stuff will get covered up, and then I'll probably have to reapply as I get in there. So many times, just to begin to separate what is light, what is dark, I'll start out with like a 10% if I'm really just lightly blocking in. Now, I probably could go directly in with 20, but I don't know, just as good practice. It's been a couple weeks since I've been worked on this, so I'm going to go in with something a little bit lighter, just till I get my bearings. Best not to try to control it too much, so I think at this point I'm not trying to get too detailed, but the light in this case is kind of coming from the front, so most of the shadows look like they're a little bit down and to the left, so that would mean the light is sort of coming in from this direction. Major separations of light and dark. So I'm going in with a warm gray. The thing to remember here is two things. I'm also not working on marker paper tonight. I'm working on this toned paper, which is closer to bonded paper or 100% rag, in which case it is going to soak up quite a bit of the marker. Whereas if you were working on a marker substrate designed for markers, you would get more resistance. So less would soak in, it would stay closer to the top. It will get a little bit lighter as I work too, but just trying to get the major lights and darks at this point. Now with the first pass, I can definitely block in shadow, but I know that a good portion of it is going to kind of lighten up, so I think for me it's more about tonality on this first pass. Just think of it like if you were squinting at this picture, some areas are going to be light, some areas are going to be dark. How do you discern the difference between the two? Now, I don't want too heavy of an application. I'm just trying to set a major tonal difference. And as you're going to see, as it dries, it will get lighter. Especially on this kind of paper, you can already see that the hat is like considerably lighter than when it first went down. I'm also thinking now, as I'm looking at this coat, I kind of don't like the way the bottom of it is tapering in with it being kind of higher in the back. I think I want it perhaps lower in the back rather than higher in the back. So before I commit to some tone there, you see what this looks like. I don't want it to have the quality of being too fancy of a coat, because he is just sort of your stowaway, if you will. So he's going to be slightly incognito. I just want to change the shape a little bit. If you lock that graphite in under the marker, it might not come up quite so well, so that's something to kind of consider. Before you go down with too much value. Sometimes that marker can lock in what you have. And I'm picturing he's just wearing more like almost a slicker, almost like a raincoat, rather than, you know, anything too tailored looking. He's spending a life at sea. This is probably mostly just for those really, really rainy nights where he might be spending it outside, versus it being anything kind of too fanciful. He's just sort of a lowly seaman. Keep my buttons kind of simple. It's almost like a pea coat in a way. Yeah, I like that better. Also, probably kind of thinking about these soles a little bit. You know, they didn't have real fortified footwear, and I can't imagine this guy had really nice shoes. So he's going to probably have something that's everyday, but yet worn down, so they can't look too tailored. On other projects I've done some referencing on shoes from the colonial period, and while they did have moments of being fanciful, the soles were nowhere near as fortified as what we would have today. Leather gets sort of worn down. And he's pretty common guy, so it's not like he's going to wear boots. Sort of gentleman's shoes, which he probably has for when he comes on land. Okay, I just wanted to make a few of those corrections before I moved on here. All right. By the way, I use the brush, just in case you're wondering, mostly so that when you don't use your hand to smear, you're not putting your oils from your hand down onto your drawing and smearing it. The brush stays really dry, sort of static free, oil free, and it's better for sort of cleaning up your surface. Okay, continuing to work my way down here. Hope you guys are all doing good out there tonight. If you're new to the stream, welcome. I'm usually out here on weekends, but I've been a little inconsistent lately. Okay. Definitely picturing the pants probably being a little darker than the shirt as well. I'm going to go with a light shirt, sort of something like you're seeing over here. So I'm going to come back in with this same 10%. Which means I probably will have to darken my jacket just a little bit. All right. So, styling, details, not yet. But I do picture this as being something a little more fantasy, I should say, rather than, say, hardcore period. So maybe, do we know exactly what pirates look like? Well, pirates have been abused a lot throughout media, and they definitely get a lot of cliches attached to them. I can't say I'm going to totally avoid that, but there's sort of real life and then there's sort of screen life, I guess, and this would definitely be for something a little more story and screen life. I was a big fan of NCYS illustrated version of Treasure Island, and I just love all those outfits that he put in his characters. So again, I'm just blocking in basic tones from this first pass. Looks a little dark at first, but it will lighten up as we move forward. Just creating so I can see the sort of tonal difference as I'm working. Of course, the more tones I put down, the more my drawing becomes a little more difficult to see. But I think in the end, that's okay. I've drawn this thing enough times now that on a render like this, I know where I'm going. And that's, again, one of the other advantages to, working out your concepts before you get to the render part. You can check back on some of the other episodes before this where I was working out the design of the body and all that good stuff. So by now, though, I know where I'm going. And even if it's a little different, that's okay. things will change or in flux. This is art. It is performance. So every time you do it, things could potentially be slightly different. All right. That's pretty good. Give a little bit of pass there. Okay. Moving on. Going to 20% now. A little more separation. So I could probably repeat stuff that I know will be darker, just so I can begin to get a little separation. I think the coat is definitely going to be a little darker. Generally, as I'm working here, I'll start with the chisel and then work my way towards the brush tip. The darker stuff gets less used, I guess, on the larger stuff. So as I'm getting towards the really dark parts, that I don't need as big of need more control, I guess. Now, 50% is probably going to be shadow, for sure. So one thing that's possible is to go straight for the shadow areas right now, rather than doing subtle tones in between. So just going straight to what I know will be shadow on this character, and shadow on the darkest parts. So I'm going to go there first. So for instance, just to help me start seeing the form a little bit more, I'm going to assume the inside of this coat is probably going to be darker. Again, adjustable later, but beginning to help me see those values. Probably a few other places like the ground, the soles. Scuffing up these shoes a little bit. Another thing I'll put here, I'll drop back to 20% for just a second. A little bit of a ground shadow. All right. So now I think I'm going to drop in and knock this jacket back a little bit more. And I do have a 30%, which I do reserve for situations like this. I would normally just do 20, 50, and maybe like a 70 or an 80, but I am going to pop in this 30 just to create a little more separation between the pant and the jacket. It will allow me to go a little darker on the pant as well, but the jacket I definitely want to be a little darker, and I think the hat most likely too. But I'm going to start out with the jacket here first. So this the other thing about using the chisel tip, you're getting a flatter application of the marker. So you kind of scrub it in. You get a more smooth value, which if you're doing basic tonality, I think is better. If you're doing subtle shadows, maybe you'd want to control the density a little bit more, or have that subtleness. This is just the basic local of the jacket. little bit of shadow there on the side of the hat for dimension. All right. Okay. Looks pretty good. I'm going to do a second pass with 20% over my pants now, just to get a nice smooth, clean application that when it lightens will be lighter than my 30% I just added to the coat. So I'll be able to see that half step difference. By the way, I'm working it more out in values right now, so I'm not too worried about details on certain things until I get there. Details would be sort of the last pass. Okay, so those pants are a little darker now than what I was working with before. There's also the idea that perhaps the skin tone itself might have a little tone, but I think in this case, since I'm pretty sure I will be adding some white pencil to give both texture and highlights to the shirt, which in this case I'm assuming is some sort of white, off-white cotton, I'll let the tone of the paper take on more of the middle ground. But I do want to come back in now with some 10% and darken a few things like the cuffs. Which should appear darker than the skin tone and help create a little separation there. I'm assuming these are some sort of wooden crates or boxes that he's probably carrying his stuff in. I suppose it could be from a ship, but I figure he's looking for his next gig. Okay, socks. Men's hose. I know that men wore hose, but I'm not sure pirates wore hose. But there was probably this thing of patting your feet inside your shoe for long periods of time, although on deck I'm sure they were barefoot. Or maybe not, maybe splinters and shit like that on the on the deck would not be good on the feet. So maybe they were wearing some sort of shoes, but I don't want the illusion of his legs being very fanciful, so if they're going to be socks, they're going to be kind of worn and ragged looking. So, how much tone do I put on a pair of socks? Maybe I'll come in with the brush tip a little bit here. It's going to be a little shadow, by the way, which we will now start blocking in a little bit more of the shadows, but I'm picturing the socks are going to probably not be very bright white. little tone on the hands. I'm now going to start bringing out a little bit of the shadows on the lightest areas, which in this case are going to be the anatomy. So I'm looking at form, shadows on tone, which 10% is not going to do a whole lot over the top of 10% existing or 20%. In fact, markers in general, as a medium, lighter values don't do anything to values that have already been put down that are darker. So a little bit of form shadow. Clavicle a little bit in here. So we're going to have some shadow underneath the jaw. Okay. Not bad. Got a pretty good base going here. Wait a second here, guys. Send a message out to some friends. Sorry about that. Alright, so now on stuff that's basically a 10% value and it's local, which isn't very much here, I'm going to now add shadows. So an example of that would be I come in with 20%. If I'm looking at the socks or stockings or whatever it is that might be down here, there's going to be a cast shadow here. So I'm stepping down to 20%. Create the shadow of the pant leg. A little bit of curvature in there. and not too dramatic. So I'm going to probably soften it just a little bit with my 10% on that edge. Okay, so other shadows, maybe a little darker, closer to the cuff here, and maybe the cuff getting a little bit darker on the downward side. This is going to be the hand, which is going to have a shadow sort of on the underside here. A little bit on that beard. I'm figuring his little tail back here is probably just going to be a dark, more silhouette shape. Okay, so you can see it's drawing a little bit more down here, and this is better. Just trying to create the illusion of a little shadow. Again, I'm not worrying about details at this point because it's about values. So I'm trying to really bring out those values a little bit more. Okay, so now the stuff that's 20% has to be a little bit darker to have a shadow. So if it's a hard shadow, I could probably go with 50. If it's a soft shadow, maybe something like a 30. So I think just to help my form pop a little bit more, I'm going to have a little shadow in here. So I'm going to come in with 50 because my pants are going to be closer to 20. So, and the light is coming from the front, which means I'm not going to get a lot of shadow in the front. But let's say I get a little bit of shadow here from the jacket. And maybe my edges of my pants kind of curving around a little bit. A little bit of a line between these two. I could delineate the line a little bit on the bottom of the pants, but not too much. Again, my light source is coming sort of straight from the front, almost the way my hand is kind of on the paper there, moving in this direction. And this is for the stuff that's 20% that needs a shadow. Like the edge of the jacket is going to have part of this arm shadow on it. So I think we would see a little bit of that. Maybe a little darker as the jacket's wrapping around the side. You can begin to apply a little bit of the shadow if you want kind of a texture effect. It's not a big deal, but as you put it down, it could have a little bit of a textural effect. That the shadows are sort of maybe describing a little bit of the form on the front. This isn't a real costume detail study, so there's probably room for margin in there. And his belt's going to probably have a little shadow underneath there. And I do picture the belt being probably a little darker. almost needs, I think, a little bit of local tone just to bring it, knock it back a little bit. All right. Looking pretty good. Darken my shoes a little. All right. Edge of the jacket for sure. So the beard's only like 20%. I will be coming in with some texture on the beard, so get into some details, or maybe I need switch over to my but I'll get a lot of texture out of my pen when I'm ready for that. Okay. So I got shadows on my 20s and on my 30% here too. Probably a little shadow here from this hand. I got little holes where the buttons are probably going to go through. Inside of the jacket, little forms turning in there. All right. Now, I think I want to drop back my darkest shadows now from 50% to my darkest dark, which is going to be my 70%. So this is pretty small area. So this is on the darkest shadows. I'm going to go pull this back to 70%. This is now, you almost have to look at it like it's the equivalent of black, but it's not. And that's because you rarely ever want to use black unless you're doing like noir inking comic, and you want that really inky black shapes. Black is very flattening. So if you're going for anything atmospheric, black should never really be black. It's just too flat, unless very few situations. So we want to try to save that black for either things that really are colored black, plus their shadow, in which case you'd make the black lighter and the shadow of something black darker. I've got the edge of this strap, by the way, which I haven't really done much with. But I'm picturing that he's kind of holding his boxes with sort of these straps that he's putting over his shoulder. Now, I am not sure I want to put the strap around the back or not. In previous versions that we were looking at here, I kind of didn't really have the strap going around the back, so I'm picturing that they're sort of wrapped around the boxes, and he has one end of a strap that he's just holding with tension, like a pulley, I guess, rather than, say, something that's a bag that's attached at the bottom. So he's really just holding it by strength, which, you know, also says something, I guess, about him. But this is going to cast a little bit of a shadow, I think, because his hand is lifting away from his body. There's going to be a little bit of that. And of course he's got a little bit of the same thing over here. And a little bit of shadow on the jacket there. And it's kind of tough to see what the jacket's doing right here, but it's not really a collared jacket. It's got a little bit of a collar, but the collar's kind of wrapping around. His head's casting a little shadow there. And there might be a little line underneath the hat, but I don't want to go too dark unless the hat's that dark. So I might end up pushing the hat a little bit darker here. All right. Let me knock my hat back to like the same color as the jacket at least. Let me try 20% first here. Let's see. Let's push it back. Little bit of depth to that on this side. And I suppose the brim could be kind of aiming down a little bit. There's a thickness to this that I think you're going to get more from one side than the other. All right. Not bad. Not bad at all, guys. I think we're just about ready to start putting some drawing back into it. Put a little bit of shadow just for pop. Again, when you squint, are you seeing 3 values? And I think that's a good test. If you can squint and see 3 values, then you got something working. Can always come back in later. But this is feeling about right to me. It's starting to come together. I think I'm ready to go back in with some drawing. Oh. A few little spots. I need this arm to pop out a little bit. I'm going to go a little darker back there. Also will help that cuff stand out a little bit. And this hand. And I'm going to hit the tail with a 30%. So go a little darker. Okay, pretty good. And just looking at it like that, I'm already seeing the depth. I'm already seeing mostly 3 values as I'm squinting here. I'm getting a pretty good 3-value system. Just little bits of form shadow, I think, to maybe soften things. So the sort of side of the face, side of the face over here, like if you can imagine what I'm doing here, I need to bring in a little bit more shadow on the side of the face. The light is coming from above, so I'm going to probably come in a little bit softer. Cheekbones. Under the eyes a little bit. And again, the hat, putting a little bit of a shadow there as well. Remember, gang, this is more about his silhouette than the deets. So just want to get the information that sort of communicates him. And you can't really see it, but I got this ponytail in there as well. But I think a lot of the rest of this is going to be the pen, the line. And I think the major form shadows are there. All right. So, time for some detailing with the pen. Now, I might have been using a little bit of a different pen than what I'm using here. High-Tech C's been around a long time. It's getting harder to find these days, but I'm actually going to go in with a 0.3. Now, normally something like this, I probably was using a 0.5, but this is so small that in scale that I need a smaller line to basically convey the same thing. Now, now I'm defining things that I am going to go down and won't be able to erase. Now, again, I am still after mostly a light and shadow form driven image versus an outlined character. This is not outlined. It uses ink, but it's using ink for texture, not ink to define form. Light and shadow has defined the form, and for the most part, that is what I have. So now I'm going to use this for texture and maybe a few spot black places, or to crispen up the silhouette edge if it needs a little bit of help in certain places. So I'm going to start off where I feel probably most comfortable, which I know that is going to be up here into his face for things like eyebrows, and our guy here's got pretty heavy eyebrows. Give me a little test first. There we go. We're good. Now, I'm not trying to draw every eyebrow, but I am trying to kind of block in what feels like kind of a heavy shape with sort of combination of value and a little bit of texture. Got to be a little bit careful of clumping. So I don't want any of these lines to form sort of little filled areas of black. So sort of stepping over to the side and clearing the head, the nib a little bit, if you will, just to make sure I'm not getting any like pools of black in there. And I'm only applying in sort of a stroke directional texture. To sort of emulate the same thing that I did over here. I have to be careful of my lights, my shadows, still keeping my looks pretty good. At this level, every little bit of black counts here. So the dangers of working kind of real small is that any little wrong move could potentially make it stand out. Now back over here, I try not to use too much ink anywhere else, and I would say that that is the same truth over here. So rather than using pen for much else except for that texture, which I really want to pop out, if I do want to go darker with tone but not with ink, then I'm going to go with my next best friend, which is going to be like a Prismacolor black. This little guy will get me the tone that I need to get edges to pop, but with the kind of control of a really fine tip. So, got to be sparing, but if there's parts of the drawing that I'm losing that need a little bit of edge, this is my edger. I have this thing I always tell in my classes, which is that there's no such thing as line. And that's true. There is no such thing as line. In space, everything, in our world as we know it, everything is three-dimensional if you get small enough. So line is really a representation of a light area next to a dark area with a lot of contrast. But even if you got really small and looked at a mark on a piece of paper, you'd see there's dimension to the filaments or the paint or the texture of the material that you're using that would be on the surface. You just don't see those dimensions from a big distance, so it looks flat. So it's kind of the same thing. You can create high contrast, give the illusion of line, but really line is kind of something that we think of as marks made on a flat surface that are graphic in nature, and I guess that part is true. They are flat and graphic in nature, which gives a style, tends to emphasize shape a lot more. And definitely inking has the ability to have a style of its own, just in the method and the technique, obviously. So like I need a little help to bring in the back of my hand here. So rather than doing it with marker, which would be very challenging to try and control these subtle little values in here, your Prismacolor can give you a softer approach. It's always better to let the audience's eye do more of the work. It's not about actually drawing what's there, it's about drawing what you see, what your brain thinks is there. One of the things I'm continuing to turn so that as I use it, I'm sharpening. If you work one side, then you're gonna get a real flat edge. So maybe a little shadow from the jacket there might be kind of cool. Now, one thing that you did not see, that you couldn't really see back here, was this kind of earring much I wanted him having. But I might end up putting a little bit of ink in there just to get that darker, to give that kind of shiny lights and high contrast. So like the edge of his neck here, I need a little bit of a line or a tiny little shadow is another way to think of it, just so that I can see it a little bit more. Can also soften some edges, which is nice, but I need just a little bit of line in there. Again, a little bit of line here. It's not really line. It's like, what is the difference between a sharp shaded narrow area and a line? Not much. Not much difference. Crispness in there, you know, and you definitely could do some of this stuff with a pen, but again, that flatness of black ink, if you're going for tone, could work against you. Where a more softer, slightly less shiny, little bit of texture in it could communicate something a little bit different. By the way, you can always come back in with a little bit of marker. It does have alcohol in it. The thing to remember about Prismacolor, it is oil-based, so it doesn't mix with water. You can erase it a little bit, for sure, but it doesn't come up if you get too heavy with it, with just a standard eraser. So the alcohol in the markers could help soften that a little bit. Okay. I'm not completely outlining, I'm kind of doing these little subtle shadow contour changes so that your brain kind of sees it, but not trying to emphasize the line too much. like to jump around a little bit so I don't get rendering in one area too much. I like to apply my values as evenly across the picture as possible. And if I stay in one area, I tend to noodle it, perhaps more than it needs to be for the rest of the picture. Also can put a little texture in there. My tip's getting a little bit dull. Which I don't need super tight, but if you really got to get in there, you gotta keep sharp. And for those of you pencil people who like to render with pencils, as you know, getting into the pores of the paper is everything. So keeping a really sharp tip, slow working circles, so you don't crush the paper that you're working on, but you actually get into the grooves of the paper. Feeling that I'm not getting in the groove, you can kind of tell when you're on that paper that you're hitting the tops, that you're not getting down in there. So you got to keep a sharpener close by, and for me, pardon the noise. Well, I'll mute you out. Hold on. Better. My sharpener's old. It tends to make a lot of noise. Spare you the grinding. Try not to be too continuous with the line. A little bit of texture in there. I'm picturing the buckle here is probably metal. Also begin to put like little bits of hairs here. Again, that little bit of line suddenly helps things pop out a bit. Alright. So these lines are going to help out a little bit down here. Let me find these edges. Again, I don't want to give the impression of outlining. It's just emphasizing maybe a little overlap, a little silhouette. So in this case, you're seeing that because I'm going with a real light touch, I'm getting a little texture. Now that texture is going to communicate for the texture of the pants. That's going to be a combination of the sharpness of your tool, the texture of the paper, and how relevant that is. You could probably hit that with a little marker and it might soften it if it's a little too rough. It's fine with me. Somewhere in here there's probably going to be kind of a wrinkle or something. A sense of maybe the knee underneath. I kind of picture them flaring out a little bit at the bottom though, so All right. It's looking pretty good. I'm going to sharpen again here real quick. A little drink of water. Texture here. Picturing these are wood. So wood, probably like pine boxes. Just cheap shipping crate wood. So the illusion of that might back off there just a little bit. A little heavy in that corner. Again, there's only so much you can do once you're down with Prismacolor, but I'm going to try to lighten this a little bit with just to get a little dimension. I might have to hit that with a little bit of white on that cuff. This is a little bit of texturing now. So once I've kind of got the forms there, now rope, probably in some sort of knot so it doesn't slip through. So I might put a little bit of texture on this thing. All right. There's a soiling on the coat. Give it a little bit of dimension. was just listening to Howard Pyle's book on pirates. Last night. All right, almost there, folks. If you're still hanging in there. Now I'm probably going to make these look a little more leathery rather than, say, cotton or wool or whatever the clothes might be. So I'm picturing something a little more worn leather. So probably some shiny, not shiny, but we'll say worn leather, which I will work on a little bit, but not with the marker too much. Little distressing. Looking pretty good though. I have to say, pretty pleased. Apologize for that. But pretty happy with the way things are coming along here. Got this little tie. His beard is probably in a tie. Sort of unshaven, shadowy neck. A little more on this side. Okay. So these straps. Sorry, my little buddy came in there. So this is one of those things where now you want to squint. Now you want to kind of look and sort of ask yourself, is there anything that needs more refining, a little bit more edge control? And maybe you got to start cleaning up from the outside now. Any of these little extra doodad wispy marks. That aren't part of the edge. Overshoots, light sketching can be brought in now. A little bit of highlighting. But strengthen that silhouette, because I can darken the inside tones, but it's really about, does it pop? So if there's any little bits of cleanup out here. It's your basic eraser here, by the way. These sort of, I used to use the tough stuff, but I can't find them anymore. I'm not sure if they're still around. But there's a lot of companies that make these. It's basically a white plastic eraser that's been packed into a sort of a smaller refillable lead there. Okay, I'm gonna go back in for a sharpen here. All right. Winding this down. All right, so drawing's coming along. Gonna throw in some highlights, and also gonna go in now with maybe a few spot blacks. But to start off, I'm gonna try lightening some things up. Now, working with my initial concept, I had kind of a whitish shirt over here, so I'm gonna do the sort of same thing by just putting little bits of highlight, almost like a little scumbling. This would be sort of light hitting directly on the high points of the shirt. Sort of the opposite of shadows, really. Maybe tapering off a little bit, getting towards the bottom. It's amazing, but just a little bit of value there just pops that right off the page. You have to be careful not to crush the surface of the paper. You know, it kind of has this wavy texture, and if you just press too hard, you burnish it. So you got to press, first of all, get very sharp and get into the grooves, and then not press too hard. Okay, I'm going to get a little white back here on the earring, just to catch a little bit of that. A little bit of light in the eye. Hardly anywhere really that there's any light. The ropes are probably not white, but I'm putting a little bit of light on these top ones, just to kind of emphasize that it's going over the top. This buckle. On the toned paper, any little bit of light really pops. I'm going to put a little bit here on the socks, just so that I can kind of see them. I don't think these are very clean. They're probably not the cleanest thing on this pirate. Maybe a little bit of shine in the shoes, but I doubt it. Can always knock that back a little bit more later. Okay. Alright, now I'm going to come back in and put a little more shadow in here. Just kind of blend things a little bit. Soften things, blend things, specifically my shadows. So I'm wanting these shadows around his face to be a little darker, a little more mysterious. Under his beard on this side. Jacket back over here. A little more form to the face. A little form shadow. Now it's all about making edges pop. This is kind of like liquefying a little bit of the Prismacolor. Maybe softening that texture a little bit that came through from this sort of scumbling with it, so it melts. The alcohol sort of hits the oil there a little bit. Sorry about that. So we're in the home stretch now. And more than actually knocking it back with a darker value, it's more like, again, like I was just saying, I'm more like melting a bit of that Prismacolor down. The alcohol in it and the markers can actually be a little bit of like a solvent. So if I've got anything where I've got too much texture from the Prismacolor, I can always soften it this way. I'm also kind of thinking, I'm not sure, this edge here seems a little crisp. The jacket's a little more flimsy and has more, I don't know, bend, a little bit of contour to things up here. it seems a little crisp considering this stuff bends, but I might try to put a little more contour in to a little bit of these edges here just to give it a more natural curvature. I mean, this part hangs off of the body, so I'm sure it's got a little more straightness too, but it just feels a little hard. So I'm going to put a little natural wave into it. Probably have to hit that a little bit with the Prismacolor to bring out the contour change just a little bit. These are sort of soiling the jacket. I'll go a little bit in the beard too, just to give the form. A bit of the cheek. Real tempting to go back to the pen. Real tempting, but let the subtlety of those values do the job. Looking pretty good. I'm going to hit these ground shadows a little bit just to help emphasize the dimension and the form. All right. Well, I think we're nearing it. In the end, folks. I think no pirate is complete without tattoo. You just gotta have the tattoo someplace. By the way, this is sort of a little saber fight I'm imagining of some point. Pretty common thing. Some ruffians. Oh, a little bit of white. I think it may be needed. I'm going to go with the jelly on this. Jellies are kind of tricky. They work best more like a dab. They're more of a dab than... Ooh, a little heavy. They're more of a dab than a scumble. Little dabs, little dabs. But the opaqueness of the white is definitely better than just the white of the shirt. Hey, Thorn to Prince, what's up? How you been? Thanks for tuning in. Just caught me at the end here. Where are you coming in from? I'm always curious when people chime in. This glorious thing called the internet. People come from everywhere. It's a little bit of side-eye action happen here, but I think that white is maybe just a little bit too heavy. I think the hat's got to go a little darker. Going in with 30%. It's a commitment, but I just keep coming back to the fact that this thing looks a little light. So let's do it. But naturally, if you're gonna go in with a shape that's darker, then all your shadows have to then go half a step darker. And there's a calculation for that, believe it or not. I don't know if you guys ever knew that, but I think the distance of your local value to black, it's half the distance from your local value to black, something like that. There's a way to calculate the actual depth of the shadow. I don't think it's all that exacting if you don't need to be, but it might help. I'm gonna pull out the 8 value Well, maybe not, if I don't have it here with me. Ah, there we go. Now, for special occasions, you go to the slightly darker value, warm gray, 8. Just to give it a little more pop in your darkest of darks. Just a few places, just in case. For instance, a little bit of really dark on the shoes, just to make those little reflections pop. Just to punch those soles a little bit. A little darker. Pretty good. All right. So here we are, approaching the finish line, and there's not too many places left where I think I really need anything else, especially for something that's a concept. I mean, I think we're getting there on the idea. I don't think there would be a whole lot more reason to have to put a ton of time and detail. We're getting there. Now for just a little bit more on the black. You need a little bit of reflection on things that are really shiny, because in addition to those brighter highlights, you need just a little bit of contrasty black, like right next to it. Wherever there is a highlight, there is a contrast next to it that is darker. That's looking pretty good. Tattoos. Let's do some tattoos and let's get out of here for this sesh. Finishing touches. A little bit of sort of soiling, mud-strewn face. Little bit of maybe anatomy shadows. A little bit of the traps there. Clavicle. Sternum notch. Sternomastoid shadow. Just little stuff that gives the body a little perspective too. All those edges, everything needs perspective and a little bit of turn. tattoos. So he's got to have something mysterious here. He's got to have some ink. I don't think I'm too interested in exactly what it is at this point. But definitely should be a little something there. I think that's it on values, though. Okay. A little bit on the hat. Just to give it a little edge. Maybe a little texture. And maybe a little tattoo. All right. Well, gang, this has been lovely. Thanks for hanging out. My name is Trey Gallaher, and this is Art Stream with Trey Gallaher. You can find me at Trey Gallaher on Instagram, Twitter. my website, treygallaher.com. And Facebook, Art by Trey Gallaher. So if you're interested in checking me out, I'm usually here on weekends. Used to be nights, but it's turning out to be a little bit more on the day side now. So, but weekends usually. Things have been a little busy in my life lately, so been a little inconsistent. So if you miss me, I'm sorry, but subscribe or follow me or get alerts or something, and when I come out, and we can hang. Love to hear from you if you have any comments. I also have Trey Gallaher on Discord, which you can see in the links below. So if you'd like to leave a message, you could do that there too. But I think I've about exhausted this one for this evening. So thanks for tuning in. It's been fun. Have a good evening. We'll see you next time. Keep drawing.